Hello, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to say that I'm really excited to listen to and hear some of your ideas for tourism in this biosphere reserve. You guys are so creative and perceptive that I feel like I'm really going to learn a lot from your presentations of your plans. So, with that, here is my draft of a site management plan for tourism in the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve. This landscape is so rugged and diverse and has really cultivated respect, stewardship, and social responsibility of its inhabitants for centuries. And I think that this has really paved the way for locals to stand up for their community rights and their part in claiming ownership for protecting this area as management and the government has sought to reestablish tourism in this area in the most recent couple decades. Reestablishment of tourism refers to the former termination of recreation activities like adventure trekking to Nanda Devi peaks. And when this termination happened, it coincided with termination of traditional practices such as grazing sheep in those high elevations and collecting medicinal plants found only in those higher plateaus. And so the management agency really created a strain between the local communities and the forest department. And the Forest Department also viewed traditional practices as ecologically unsustainable and economically unsound. And they saw these community owned land holdings as wasteful. And so other management practices really kind of led to weakening traditional social responsibilities. So enforcements and wildlife population increases has led to human wildlife conflicts. And then traditionally, communities had low impact water management, but the government provided treated water services that have now been found to be less economically sustainable. The management strategy I would like to use is the limits of acceptable change, and there's a few reasons why I really enjoy this strategy. And the first one is that it imbues participatory management. This is something that the people of Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve have shown to be very important to them from the very beginning, that they want to take ownership over development and tourism in this area. It also contributes to an effective management plan and identifies roles of community members and sets those expectations of how community members need to be involved. I like that it outlines zones or opportunity classes that help to strategically identify acceptable limits that are both ecologically and socially acceptable. It promotes diverse tourism opportunities in the appropriate settings, and it identifies your set of indicators for effective monitoring within those zones. So you can get very specific with how those zones need to be monitored and evaluated and managed in the future. The Man in the Biosphere program encourages the establishment of 3 key zones: the core, the buffer, and the transitional zone. And so I think when these zones were established for this portion of the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve, there was more of a prioritization of simplicity over the effective management design. And so moving forward, I think we need to assess these boundaries and monitor these zones to ensure that sensitive areas are in fact being protected from high impact recreational opportunities. And so we can use these limits of acceptable change as guiding principles for development and helping us to establish where these boundaries should be if indeed they need to be altered. So a zoning scheme takes into consideration that some areas within the core, buffer, and transitional zones may not be as suitable for different forms of tourism as others. And so these zones can help to assess, monitor, and evaluate Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve for various conditions. So one of these zones in this scheme is temporal, and this just takes into consideration the 3 seasons: summer, rainy, and winter season, and when certain trails and certain areas need to be closed to accommodate for these seasons. Another zone is cultural preservation, and this can be restrictive of tourism and infrastructure, any sort of development that might interfere with traditional values. One aspect of cultural preservation can even include a zone that overlaps the core and buffer zones in order to allow grazing and collection of natural resources like medicinal plants. Another type of zone is cultural enhancement, and similar to cultural preservation, this zone actually allows for development for tourism, but its objectives and goals ensures cultural diversity and conservation, and it's economically equitable. This has typically a low to mid impact on the zone. Education zones allow for infrastructure and are planned for educational and interpretive uses. So the goals here are really to connect visitors and tourists to the site and provoke education and awareness of the site. And ecological restoration. So this includes restoration which may simultaneously restore traditional practices. So evaluating whether or not these traditional practices are sustainable or unsustainable, and if they actually have an effect on the ecological integrity of the landscape. Here is an example of how to use the education zone for a trail system and infrastructure in this area of the buffer zone located on the western portion of Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve. Now, this education zone follows the limits of acceptable change opportunity class 3, which calls for moderate use and moderate impact. So, for example, visitors might expect to see other user groups while they're hiking on these trails. And so 3 examples of potential trails for this area could be a story trail. Story trails are meant to be easily accessible, so people who have any sort of disabilities, senior citizens, young children can easily hike this trail. It's less than half a mile. It's a loop, and it features a story throughout the trail that connects culture to nature. So the idea is that as you are hiking this trail, you are reading a children's story, and preferably a story that is local to the area. Another trail is a nature trail that highlights the flora and fauna and the ecosystem services. So how do the people rely on this ecosystem, and traditionally and in more modern times? And then a scenic trail, so kind of to the right of the road that leads to Tolma, you can follow a ridge line, and this can focus on the peaks surrounding this area, their cultural significance, what are the stories behind these peaks, and some of the geological processes, how the glaciers have retreated and carved out this landscape. So this is in the buffer zone, like I mentioned, and then this is an education zone within this. So the idea is that the infrastructure in this area allows for a small parking area, some picnic tables, information and maps, interpretive signs, potable water, and of course, establishing some of those trails. I chose this location because there is an existing multi-day trek that begins and ends in these villages, and so I think that these villages would be socially acceptable of allowing for more tourism to this area. And so then I added which of the Nanda Devi declarations that this encourages, and that is ensuring the exchange and sharing of experiences with communities of other regions to develop ecotourism. And so there is a